Imagine you are the biggest, baddest empire on the planet. You have the best army, the most advanced weapons, and an ego the size of the moon. But every time your citizens hear one specific name, they completely lose their minds. Mothers literally use this guy's name to scare their misbehaving kids. Hannibal ad portas. Hannibal is at the gates. Forget ghosts, forget monsters. The real boogeyman of ancient Rome was a man with a serious grudge, a brilliant military mind from North Africa who decided that playing by the rules was for losers. Welcome back, my fellow history nerds and language learners, to the BrainBoost English podcast. This is the place where we roast history, learn English, and realize that human beings have been absolutely unhinged since the dawn of time. Before we begin, I want you to close your eyes. Imagine you are standing inside a dimly lit military tent in the year 218 BC. The air is incredibly thick. You can smell a delightful, overpowering mix of smoky campfires, cheap sour wine, unwashed soldiers, and... wait, is that elephant dung? Yes it is. Sitting in the corner is a rugged, battle-hardened man staring at a piece of animal skin map. He looks up at you with an intense, terrifying glare. This is Hannibal Barca, and he is about to pull off the craziest, most suicidal military stunt in human history. To understand Hannibal, we have to go back to his childhood. You see, people are not usually born with a burning desire to destroy an entire civilization. Usually, they inherit it. Hannibal's father was Hamilcar Barca, a top-tier, heavy-hitting general of Carthage. Carthage was a wealthy maritime empire located in modern-day Tunisia, and they were basically Rome's biggest rival in the Mediterranean Sea. Hamilcar had just lost the First Punic War against Rome, and let me tell you, he was salty. Extremely salty. He had to pay a massive war fine to the Romans and give up highly valuable territories. So, what does a toxic, vengeance-driven father do in the ancient world? He takes his 9-year-old son, Hannibal, to a religious temple. He sacrifices an animal to the gods, dips the boy's hands in the blood, and makes him swear a sacred, unbreakable oath. The oath was simple: never be a friend to Rome. Talk about generational trauma. While other 9-year-old kids were playing with wooden swords and eating dirt, little Hannibal was officially signing up to be Rome's #1 hater. He became the ultimate dedicated anti-fan from day one. Fast forward a couple of decades. Hannibal is not a kid anymore. He grew up in Spain, learning the bloody art of war, sleeping in the dirt with his soldiers, and becoming an absolute beast of a commander. When he finally took over the Carthaginian army in Spain, he was like an aggressive CEO taking over a struggling startup and immediately aiming for a hostile takeover of a massive tech giant. He started his campaign by attacking Saguntum, a city in Spain that was closely allied with Rome. Rome sent very angry letters to Carthage. They basically said, "Stop that right now, hand Hannibal over, or we go to war." Hannibal essentially left them on red. The Second Punic War officially kicked off. Rome thought this war would be a walk in the park. They planned to fight the war on their own terms, attacking Spain and invading Africa. But Hannibal hit them with the biggest Uno reverse card in military history. He knew that taking boats to Italy was a suicide mission because Rome controlled the seas. The land route along the coast was also heavily guarded by Roman legions. So, Hannibal looked at his map, pointed at the Swiss Alps, a massive, freezing, treacherous mountain range that normal people would struggle to hike with modern winter gear, and he calmly said, "Yeah, let's just walk over that." Let us talk about the logistics of this absolute madness. In the year 218 BC, Hannibal gathered a massive army of around 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and 38 war elephants. Yes, you heard that right, elephants. Animals from the scorching, blazing plains of Africa. He looked at these majestic, tropical creatures and thought, you know what they really need right now? Snow and freezing altitudes. The journey was a complete and utter nightmare. It was not a scenic mountain trek for sightseeing. It was a brutal, daily fight for survival. First, they had to cross the massive Rhone River while hostile barbarian tribes stood on the other side, throwing spears at them. How do you get 38 angry, heavy elephants? How do you get 38 angry, heavy elephants across a deep river? You build giant wooden rafts, cover them in dirt and branches so the elephants think it is solid ground, and you pray to the gods they do not panic. Spoiler alert, some of them absolutely panicked, fell into the freezing water, and had to use their trunks as breathing snorkels to walk across the riverbed. Nature's scuba divers at work. But the river crossing was a joke compared to the Alps themselves. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the temperature dropped well below freezing. Men who had never seen snow in their entire lives were now freezing to death in their thin tunics and leather sandals. The mountain paths were incredibly narrow, slippery, and completely covered in ice. One wrong step, and a soldier, a horse, or a massive elephant would plummet thousands of feet into the dark abyss below. To make matters infinitely worse, local mountain tribes were constantly ambushing them. These tribesmen played the ancient world's deadliest game of Donkey Kong, standing on the cliffs above and rolling massive boulders down onto Hannibal's trapped army. It was absolute carnage. At one point during the descent, their path was completely blocked by a giant landslide. A massive wall of solid rock stood directly between them and Italy. Did Hannibal turn back? Did he give up? Of course not. He went full mad scientist on that mountain. He ordered his freezing men to cut down trees, build a massive bonfire right on top of the blocking rock, and wait until the stone was burning red hot. Then, he ordered them to pour their rations of sour wine, basically cheap vinegar, all over the hot rock. The sudden, extreme change in temperature and the chemical reaction caused the solid rock to crack and shatter, allowing his men to dig through and clear a path. Science and desperation make a great team. After 15 grueling, horrific days in the freezing mountains, Hannibal finally reached the other side and looked down at the lush green plains of northern Italy. But the cost of this stunt was absolutely devastating. Out of the massive army he started with, he only had about 20,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry left. He had lost more than half of his entire fighting force to the freezing cold, starvation, sickness, and tribal ambushes. Yet, miraculously, almost all of the war elephants survived the trip, although they were incredibly skinny, shivering, and probably extremely confused about their life choices. Imagine being a Roman soldier guarding the northern border of Italy. You are just chilling, drinking some cheap wine, thinking the Alps are an impenetrable, permanent wall of natural defense. Suddenly, you hear a loud, terrifying trumpeting sound echoing through the valleys. You look up, and an army of frostbitten Africans, angry Spaniards, and literal elephants is marching down the snowy mountain right toward you. Rome was caught completely off guard. They scrambled to send their legions north to crush this weakened, exhausted, and starving invading force. But Hannibal was not just a crazy guy who enjoyed extreme hiking. He was a tactical genius, a master of deception, and the Romans were about to walk right into a series of the deadliest traps the ancient world had ever seen. The nightmare for Rome was just beginning. The Roman Senate, furious and completely humiliated that a guy with some frosty elephants had bypassed their majestic Alps, sent wave after wave of their finest soldiers to swat Hannibal like an annoying mosquito. But Hannibal was not a mosquito. He was a strategic apex predator. In his first few battles in Italy, like at the River Trebia and Lake Trasimene, he absolutely schooled the Roman commanders. At Trasimene, he literally hid an entire army of tens of thousands of men in the morning fog along the edge of a lake. When the arrogant Roman army marched by, the fog lifted, and it was the deadliest game of peekaboo in human history. The Romans were pushed into the water and slaughtered. But Hannibal's absolute masterpiece, the moment that secured his place in the Military Hall of Fame forever, happened in the year 216 BC at a dusty little place called Cannae. Rome had finally had enough. They raised the largest army they had ever assembled in their entire history, an absolute juggernaut of 80,000 heavily armed Roman legionaries. They marched out to crush Hannibal once and for all. Hannibal only had about 50,000 men. He was drastically outnumbered, fighting on enemy soil, and facing the ancient equivalent of a heavily armored bulldozer. Any normal general would have ordered a tactical retreat. Hannibal, however, looked at the massive Roman army and essentially said, "Perfect, I have them right where I want them." The Romans relied on brute force. Their tactic was essentially to form a massive, unstoppable block of men and just punch straight through the center of the enemy line. Hannibal knew exactly what they were going to do. So, he arranged his troops in a bizarre crescent shape that bulged out in the middle toward the Romans. He placed his weakest, most exhausted troops right in the center of this bulge, and his best, most veteran fighters on the far edges. When the battle started, the Romans charged exactly as predicted, slamming into the weak Carthaginian center. Just as Hannibal planned, his center slowly began to back up, retreating step by step under the immense pressure. The Romans thought they were winning. They smelled blood and pushed forward eagerly, squeezing tighter and tighter together as they advanced into the pocket, but it was a deadly trap. By pushing the center back, the Roman army had unknowingly walked into a U-shape. Suddenly, Hannibal gave the signal. His elite troops on the edges, who had not moved an inch, swung forward like giant doors closing shut. At the same time, Hannibal's heavy cavalry, which had already chased the Roman horses off the battlefield, came sweeping back around and crashed directly into the rear of the Roman army. The mighty Roman legion was completely surrounded. They were packed so tightly together in the center that most of the soldiers could not even lift their swords or swing their arms. It was not a battle anymore. It was an industrial-scale execution. In a single afternoon, over 50,000 Romans were butchered. The panic, the dust, the screams of men who realized they were completely trapped with absolutely nowhere to run. It was a catastrophic disaster for Rome. To put this in perspective, Hannibal wiped out roughly 20% of the adult male population of Rome in just one day. He collected thousands of golden rings from the dead fingers of Roman nobles and sent them back to Carthage, basically pouring them on the floor of the Carthaginian Senate as the ultimate mic drop. You would think that after completely annihilating the Roman army, Hannibal would march straight to the city of Rome, kick the doors down, and claim ultimate victory. His cavalry commander, a guy named Hannibal, urged him to do exactly that, saying they could be eating dinner in the Roman capital in 5 days. But Hannibal hesitated. He refused. He knew he did not have the massive siege equipment or the supply lines needed to break through the towering, incredibly thick stone walls of Rome. Hannibal allegedly looked at him in disgust and said, "You know how to win a victory, Hannibal, but you do not know how to use it." That sentence probably haunted Hannibal for the rest of his life. Rome was terrified, traumatized, and completely out of options. They appointed a dictator named Quintus Fabius Maximus, who came up with the most annoying, frustrating, but brilliant strategy ever invented. It became known as the Fabian strategy. Basically, Fabius realized that fighting Hannibal head-to-head was a guaranteed death sentence. So, he simply stopped fighting. The Romans began ghosting Hannibal. They shadowed his army from a safe distance, refusing to engage in battle, while burning all the crops and poisoning the wells in front of him. They played an excruciating, long game of cat and mouse. Hannibal was stranded in Italy for 15 long, exhausting years. He was like an unwanted guest crashing on Rome's couch, tearing up the living room, but completely unable to get the keys to the house. His men were tired, his resources were dwindling, and the politicians back in Carthage were extremely stingy, refusing to send him significant reinforcements. He was winning all the battles, but slowly losing the war. Meanwhile, a young Roman commander named Publius Cornelius Scipio was rising through the ranks. Scipio was one of the few survivors of the bloodbath at Cannae. But unlike the traumatized Roman senators, Scipio had paid close attention to Hannibal's tactics. He practically copied Hannibal's homework. Instead of fighting Hannibal in Italy, Scipio pulled a genius move. He took a Roman army and invaded Spain, destroying Carthage's supply bases, and then he sailed directly for North Africa, threatening the city of Carthage itself. The politicians in Carthage completely panicked and desperately recalled Hannibal to come home and defend the motherland. In the year 202 BC, at the Battle of Zama in North Africa, the ultimate showdown took place. The master, Hannibal, against the student, Scipio. Hannibal brought out his famous war elephants, hoping to trample the Roman lines, but Scipio was ready. He ordered his men to blow loud, deafening horns to terrify the animals, and he arranged his troops with wide, empty lanes between them. When the elephants charged, the Romans simply stepped aside, shouting like matadors at a bullfight, letting the massive beasts run harmlessly down the empty lanes and right off the battlefield. Scipio then used Hannibal's own flanking tactics against him. Hannibal was decisively defeated on his home turf. The Second Punic War was over, and Rome was the undisputed champion of the Mediterranean. But Rome still held a massive, toxic grudge. Even though Hannibal was defeated and Carthage was stripped of its power, the Romans could not sleep peacefully knowing he was still breathing. They demanded that Carthage hand him over. Hannibal, refusing to be paraded through the streets of Rome in chains, fled to the east. He spent his final years living out of suitcases, working as a highly paid military consultant for various Eastern kings who had beef with Rome. Even in his old age, he was still pulling off crazy stunts, like winning a naval battle by having his sailors throw clay pots filled with venomous snakes onto the enemy ships. Absolute madness until the very end. Eventually, Rome's assassins caught up with him in a place called Bithynia, in modern-day Turkey. The local king betrayed Hannibal, allowing Roman soldiers to completely surround his house. Realizing there was no escape, the 64-year-old general calmly took out a ring he always wore, which contained a deadly, fast-acting poison. His reported last words were dripping with sarcasm and bitterness. Let us relieve the Romans from the anxiety they have so long experienced, since they think it tries their patience too much to wait for an old man's death. He drank the poison and died on his own terms. Hannibal Barca lost the war, but in a weird, twisted way, he won a permanent spot in Rome's psyche. Before Hannibal, Rome was just a strong republic. After Hannibal, the sheer trauma and terror he inflicted forced the Romans to adapt, evolve, and transform into a ruthless, unstoppable military machine. The irony of history is that the greatest, most terrifying enemy of the Roman Empire was also the very man who inadvertently taught them how to conquer the entire world. That wraps up today's epic tale on the BrainBoost English podcast. If you learned a new word, or if you just enjoyed hearing about how a guy with an elephant army gave the Roman Empire a 15-year panic attack, make sure you hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and share this video with your fellow language learners. Drop a comment below telling me which historical figure you want us to roast next. Until next time, stay curious, stay slightly cynical, and keep boosting that vocabulary.